Hope you're well, and know that you're all anxious to hear about our plans for return to work, both to help those of you very anxious to get back and be productive, but also how we will support those of you who feel safer right now at home and wish to continue teleworking, how we'll go about that. And there'll be information provided shortly from the NIH leadership, and I look forward to moving forward in some sense of getting campus happening. For those of you listening from outside the NIH, I hope that you are doing well, and I assume that you're also waiting to hear or in the process of considering how we'll all get back to research spaces and get started, and I wish you all the very best as that happens. The topic of today's workshop is sharpening your mentoring skills. I should give credit for that title to my colleagues from UCSF. I have for many years, not this year because of the pandemic, but for many years before, had the opportunity to spend a few days on their campus working with PIs in their graduate programs on developing mentoring skills. And somebody there, I'm not sure who, came up with this great title, which I really like because it implies to me that we're always developing our mentoring skills, that there's no sort of end point. We're always growing and learning. Each mentee is different. The situations are different. The contexts are different. And so we're constantly sort of developing and sharpening our skills. And scientists are such good lifelong learners. And sometimes I think we focus on lifelong learning in the scientific arena and not so much lifelong learning in terms of our management skills and mentoring skills and leadership skills. A few details about the webinar. I already dragged a PDF of this presentation into the control box here, so you should be able to download it and have the slides. In addition, at the end of the talk or sometime shortly thereafter, somebody in the NIH Office of Intramural Training and Education will email you out another set of slides just in case you have trouble downloading them. And that way you can have a permanent record. This is being taped. You can access the tape through the same link that you used to log on today. Eventually, and hopefully soon, it will be closed captioned and then uploaded to the NIH OITE YouTube video. We will continue doing an expanded career development program throughout the entire spring and likely into the summer, although I know people will be hopefully getting back to some hands-on work. We'll all need to be going at a slower pace, sharing the space. There'll still, I hope, be time that you can fill with career development. So if you are from outside NIH and you're interested in knowing about these webinars and you haven't signed up yet for our informational listserv, just visit our website and do that. You can also just email me and I'll make sure the information gets to you. If you have problems hearing me, it is very much likely to be an issue on your end with bandwidth. What you should do is quit and rejoin, and nearly always that solves the problem. Not always, but nearly always. If the slides don't advance, again, assume it's you and quit and back out and try again. But occasionally it's on my side, and I saw as I was flipping through the attendance, some NIH fellows, I recognize their names. So Idowu, if you could use the question box if the slides aren't advancing, but I'm talking as if they are, to let me know, and then I'll try to figure that out. And anybody who has troubles or wants to let me know something can just use the question box. Earlier today, while I was doing another webinar, my computer completely crashed, froze. It took me quite a bit of time to get back on. I'm a little bit worried that there's something going on with my laptop. I'm waiting for NIH IT, and they haven't been able to get on here to take a look yet. And if that happens, I will try to get back on, but in all likelihood, what we'll do is just email you and reschedule this for another time. I'm really hopeful that it won't happen, but there's a small chance that we'll have some issues. So with that, let's start a little bit and talk about developing our mentoring skills. You know, it's interesting, I've done a whole lot of different webinars since the stay-at-home orders came down. And in most cases, I felt strongly that I needed to change the material to reflect the current situation. But in this case, I actually decided not to not to change the material. I know that we'll be doing some remote mentoring, so maybe some tips or tricks in here won't exactly apply now, but I truly hope and believe that at some point we will be back and we will be mentoring in person. And I decided not to make changes to the material. The one change I did make was take out a lot of the prompts for small group discussions, role play scenarios. I'm going to see how this goes today. Hopefully you'll give me some feedback about whether you'd be interested in a 1 hour or 90-minute more interactive session where we actually move through some discussions in small breakout rooms, actually do some scenarios. I just decided to try this in a webinar format first, and then to consider how we can extend the learning. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. And I want to start with this one first principle, and that is that managing and mentoring others in research environments is simultaneously rewarding and difficult, sometime in the very same moment. Sometimes we have long stretches where we're just really enjoying the mentoring, but then we hit a really difficult patch. The honest truth is some trainees they poke us a little bit more. They're a little harder for us to mentor for whatever reason. And sometimes we feel the difficulty much more than we feel the reward. It's a learning opportunity all the time. We really have to keep our own growth mindset about it, meaning that we accept that we're constantly learning and evolving, that we are going to experience hard spots, and that we use those to enhance our learning. To mentor others effectively, we really need to know something about how students learn and the different factors that affect student learning. But we also need to learn to manage ourselves, because it's our job to cultivate an environment and a relationship that promotes learning. We are the responsible party, not to say our mentees aren't responsible to be engaged, to care, to learn, to come to us for issues. They most certainly are. But we hold we're the stewards of the relationship, and because of hierarchy, it's really up to us to work hard to make an environment that works for each trainee, and to cultivate a relationship that's built on mutual trust and learning, and not on intimidation and any sense of you're here to serve me. So I really like to start these workshops with just a little bit about managing ourselves, because the honest truth is that we can be much better mentors and much better colleagues and collaborators, for that matter, and much better mentees when we learn about managing ourselves. Emotional regulation is a really key element to becoming a good mentor. So first of all, I think we have to deal with our own stresses and anxieties in general about our science and our career, and specifically about mentoring a student. I mean, it takes time to mentor a student. Sometimes people will say to me, I'd really love to have a summer intern or a postbac or an undergrad because I need them to help with my work. But the honest truth is that often it takes more time than you get, especially at the outset. And so we need to be certain that we're in a good place and time to take on a mentoring role. So we have to ask ourselves where our science and career is at, and can we carve out time to support a student? And then we also need to think about what are we stressed about in terms of mentoring a student, right? What are we excited about, but what worries us about it? And so first and foremost, I think that we need to start there. If we start with some self-awareness about where we're at career-wise and science-wise and in terms of our confidence around our mentoring skills, that gives us the ability to work to control our own stress level. Because if we control our own stress level, we can sort of appropriately take care of our worries, like I talked about above, but we also can promote learning by staying calm and engaged and helping students control their stress level and their worries. The other thing that we really need to think about in terms of managing ourselves is how do we set boundaries? For two reasons. First of all, so that we can get other important work done, right? Like I said, it takes time to mentor a student. And we want to put time into that, but we also have a responsibility to our own career and we want to make some progress. So we need to set some appropriate boundaries so we can get other important work done. And the other reason we need to set appropriate boundaries is so that we can keep things professional. Sometimes a graduate student is mentoring an undergrad and you're like 2 years apart and it may seem like a natural friendship, but it really is a professional mentoring relationship. And some element of professional friendship might be involved, but we really want to know what our boundaries are and be thoughtful about setting them. In terms of wellness resources, if you're at NIH, I want to encourage you to always be on the lookout for our emails about wellness and resilience resources. If you're outside NIH, you want to look at what your organization offers. Many of our webinars now are open to everyone, and so these are great resources for people outside the NIH as well. We can't really be a good mentor or manager until we are really attentive to our own stress level and our own self-care needs. A really key principle of self-management that I want to use to lay the foundation of all of this is, in the face of mentoring challenges, we want to be able to respond and not react. So a reaction is really quick, it's not well considered, it's often tense, it can feel really threatening because it can come with some body language that feels a little threatening or a tone of voice or an eye roll. Reactions happen because we first typically engage our reptilian brain, our survival instincts. We start, something happens in lab, it doesn't go well, our trainee lets us know about a big mistake, or they give us a draft of a poster and we think, oh my gosh, this is going to take so much work. And we respond first from our reptilian brain, our amygdala, right? And those types of reactions can really hinder learning. On the other hand, a response is a bit delayed, it's thought out, it's calm, it's not threatening, or at least it's less threatening. I mean, we're intimidating when a student is working with us. At least we have the potential to be intimidating. But the calmer we are and the more thought out our response is, the more chance we have of being less threatening. And when we're less threatening, more learning happens. These functions really come from our higher cortical function, right? Our frontal lobe, our ability to reason and solve problems. Generally, in order to engage these higher cortical functions, we need to take a deep breath and slow down our fight, flight, freeze response. And so that's an overall goal of self-management tools, is so that we can respond and not react. With that introduction, I won't talk a lot about wellness, but I hope you'll use some of the resources that we've already put up on our YouTube video. But with that introduction of sort of stressing that the foundation for doing a good job at this is our wellness and our ability to regulate our emotions, particularly our negative emotions, so that we can develop an environment that promotes learning. With that introduction, let's talk a little bit about boundaries, expectations, how we actually mentor. So I want to just start and suggest that you consider boundaries around these 4 things. First of all, how will you communicate with your intern? Will you give them your cell phone number and say, call me? Will you ask them to text? Will you use only your NIH email or your work email? what strategies will you use to communicate with your intern? They need to know how to reach out to you. They also need to know when you'll be available, right? So I've heard stories, from postdocs who are mentoring summer interns about, I got their draft at 9 p.m. and I stayed up all night to work on it, right? They gave it to me last minute. What else could I do? But really, if we think about considering and setting boundaries, our mentees will know when we're available, and they'll know when the right times are to get work done. I think it's very important for you to keep in mind that you want to have boundaries around socializing on and off campus. Socializing in groups with your mentees is a great way to build a connection with them. You want to always be professional, of course, but it can be having a group lunch can be an excellent way to be human and to provide support and encouragement. But socializing alone, particularly off campus, but even sometimes on campus, depending on how you do it, can lead to a blurring of professional boundaries. And it's when we blur professional boundaries that things can get very difficult. And in this time of social media, I think it's really important for you to consider, will you friend them on Facebook, right? Will you follow them on Twitter? If you post in whatever social media you like to use about personal things, do you want them following you? I generally encourage people to be really cautious about what they put on social media anyway. You shouldn't be worried about what your trainees see, but the honest truth is that we all do different things on social media, and boundaries around that are really important to keep in mind. For NIH trainees, grad students, and postdocs and postbacks in the intramural program who might mentor a summer intern remotely, during this time, or next year, hopefully back in person. I just want to remind you that our policy does not allow for dating or close personal relationships between individuals in a hierarchical relationship. The hierarchy makes it very, very hard for the person at the bottom of the hierarchy to say no. And so it's important as you're setting boundaries to keep in mind whatever policies and rules there are on your campus. And I know about the NIH policy, so I'm mentioning that here. Each of you will be different about whether you'll want to take questions in the evenings, how you're going to communicate. Some people are very email driven. Some people really are like, it's fine, just text me. Some people don't want to be texted. It's their personal phone and they'd rather not give out that phone number. You each get to decide, but you should sit a little bit and think it through, and you should articulate those boundaries clearly with your interns. It's interesting, usually we have a big discussion about this. I stop at this point and people get into small groups. Some people like to say, I'm available all the time. Just come see me whenever you have a question. And some people don't like that. They find that they get interrupted too often and they can't get traction in getting any other work done. And so they like to say, I'm going to meet with you this time, and then you can interrupt me at other times if it's an emergency, right? You get to choose. You just have to think it through. And it's different for everybody. I find that either extreme is what mentees struggle with. If you don't give any clear guidance about when you're available and just say, hey, just let me know when you need something, then it's hard for a lot of trainees and mentees to reach out, especially introverted ones, especially new learners, right? Who haven't been in a lab before. If on the other hand, you are too rigid about when people can reach out to you, then when a problem happens, they think, oh, it's outside that rigid time, and so I can't reach out. And then you miss hearing about problems or opportunities at the right time. And so to me, trying not to be on either extreme is pretty important. Each of you will figure that out. The interesting thing is that what works with one mentee might not work with another. And so you might have to flex your style a little bit. You know, I talked in the last workshop I did, which was about getting mentored. I talked about managing up, which is flexing your style to get the most out of your relationship with your boss. And remember the idea also that you flex your style down to accommodate the learning needs of your mentee. So you can think about it both ways. So our goal is to promote learning. When we bring a summer intern or a college student into the lab, or we're going to mentor a new grad student and we're a more senior grad student or postdoc, our goal is to promote their learning while getting work done and helping them get work done. But our goal is really to promote learning. If we want people to learn, they have to feel safe. People cannot learn in the middle of a chronic fight, flight, freeze response. They have to feel safe. If people feel safe, they can ask questions, ask for help, they can make mistakes, they can learn from their mistakes, right? That whole thing about growth mindset and learning from mistakes. They can learn from their own mistakes on their own, but maybe we also need to give them some input to help them learn from mistakes. If they feel safe, they'll tell us what they're thinking, feeling, and worrying about, so we can help them address those issues. They can take risks, right, and suggest an experiment. They can take risks and say, I'd like to try this on my own. They can take risks and ask a question at lab meeting. So if we promote a sense of safety, then we get all these valuable things out of our trainees. Right? And sometimes it is that novice asking us a question that makes us think about things in a different way. And so I really want to encourage you to keep in mind that your goal is to build a safe environment. Student learning depends upon other things besides feeling safe. So let's talk about all those things. And one is their natural abilities. Notice I didn't say ability. There are many abilities that people have. Dexterity, the ability to problem solve, the ability to quickly read, the ability to understand lab notebooks and how to just keep their data organized. Some come naturally, some come less naturally. Every trainee comes to you with a mix of sort of natural abilities and abilities that take more cultivation, right? We're a mix of strengths and we're a mix of liabilities that need to be shored up. And that's one key thing that determines how they do in your group. Also, their background, the background in specific topics relative to your group. You need to remember a couple of things. Generally, when you take undergraduate students or a first-year grad student, a summer intern, what you're doing is working with someone who is an early stage learner. So they will never have as much background as would be helpful. In fact, we need to help them appreciate that that they are early stage learners, that they don't need to learn everything. Usually the first week into a new set of interns that I work with, they say they're overwhelmed. First week in, I can understand like the first 3 sentences of lab meeting. And they say that as if there's something wrong with them. But actually, that's the reality for early stage learners. We bring people into a really, really intense high knowledge environment, and they have to really build from the ground up. So first and foremost, you got to remember that. The second thing is that sometimes we see pretty big gaps and we think, how could they not know this? Gaps often reflect a lack of resources, right? Their school didn't have the lab that they needed. Right now, lots of students in college, right, have gone through an experience where labs were canceled. So they're going to have less hands-on experience, and that's likely to continue. Some college students now aren't going to have summer internships because many have been canceled, including those at NIH. So you might see gaps that reflect a lack of resources, whether that's an academic resource or a hands-on research experience. Sometimes we have a tendency to assume gaps reflect a lack of ability or interest or commitment. Sometimes they just reflect a lack of resources. Now, it is still the trainee's responsibility to address those gaps, and it's your responsibility to kindly point out those gaps. but don't assume that they're not interested or didn't care or don't care because of it. It's really something that can be very, very challenging for students who enter a lower resourced environment into a much higher resourced environment, right? They just have gaps that they need to address. The honest truth is, even if we're in very high resourced environments, we all have gaps anyway. So we just have to keep in mind that gaps can be for a lot of reasons. Student learning depends upon their personality, their communication, and their learning style. I've talked a lot about communication styles and personality in the course of the many webinars I've done. You can go back to the OITE webpage and the YouTube channel. If you just Google OITE YouTube, NIH OITE YouTube, you'll find it. And you can watch some of those. You really should understand a bit about communication styles and personality and learning styles if you're going to be a good mentor. In terms of personality, on Friday, Lori Conlon, who's the director of the postdoc office within the OITE, she will be teaching a webinar called Workplace Dynamics 1, which is a dive into personality and communication styles. And there's a lot of resources available already in the webinars in terms of that. Another thing that student learning depends upon is their ability to be resilient and to grow through setback. Because being a brand new learner in an intense environment is bound to come with some setback. And as you all know, science comes with setback. There's a workshop, a webinar, Becoming a Resilient Scientist, on our webpage. It teaches a lot about the science of resilience. It's great for mentees because they really need to hear it. It's great for mentors because you too have to be resilient and grow through setback. Every time I give that webinar, I learn from it myself. I feel like my resilience skills improve. And so you'll want to understand a little bit about resilience and setback so that when your trainee experiences a setback, you can talk them through it. You can help them use less catastrophizing language. You can help them reframe the situation as an opportunity to learn. And then finally, student learning depends on how they feel about themselves and their place at your institution and in your group. Remember, I said you have to be safe to take risks and learn. And if you're not feeling very self-confident or you're feeling really out of place, you're the only student of color in an environment that's not very diverse, you've come from another country and you're very acutely aware of your language skills and how they impact interactions. You're the only woman in a male environment, the only male in a predominantly female environment. When we sort of look around ourselves and see people who mirror us and make us feel comfortable, even if they, I mean, we're all different, but right, if the environment makes us feel comfortable, then we can learn better than if the environment is not making us feel comfortable. So there's a bit about a big piece of how we feel about ourselves in terms of how we learn. And those are things that promote learning. Here are some things that undermine learning. And these are some flip sides, actually, of some of the bullets on the previous slide. One thing that really undermines learning is low self-confidence and the impact of imposter fears and stereotype threat. And we'll learn both about imposter fears and stereotype threat today. I won't talk so much about self-confidence today, although we'll be having a webinar later in June focused pretty much on areas around building self-confidence, helping trainees build self-confidence, building self-confidence yourself. One of the key things about building up somebody's self-confidence is them realizing that you believe in them and them then therefore believing in themselves. Another thing that builds up self-confidence is us giving mentees a chance to learn in a low stress environment. So we don't give them a critical reagent and say, oh, we really have to get this right. We don't have them do cell culture and put their cells right next to our incredibly valuable cells, right? Because then if theirs get infected, we start to get worried about, oh, what's going to happen to ours? We don't have them work under time constraints. We build self-confidence by allowing them to succeed. Every success, every micro success builds self-confidence for the next time. Also, vulnerabilities unrelated to the workplace can undermine student learning. And I think this is something we really need to keep in mind right now. If your family is really struggling economically because of the coronavirus pandemic, or in general because of economic inequality in this country, if you are homesick, if you are dealing with a chronic illness, if you have some mental health issues happening, whatever vulnerabilities you have, they can be unrelated to the workplace, but we don't leave them at home. And so they can really impact our ability to focus and do well at work. Another thing that can undermine success is how difficult it can be to receive feedback. Even when feedback is delivered well, it can really hurt. It can really undermine self-confidence. Sometimes it can really surprise a student because they've been working hard and their perception is that they were doing pretty well. So one thing you can do in this regard is learn how to give feedback well. And I encourage you to read the book, Thanks for the Feedback. I also encourage you to watch the webinar I did on feedback resilience. Although I'm talking there about receiving feedback, every time I give it, I'm better at giving feedback myself. So I taught it like a week ago and I had to give some difficult feedback to somebody in my office. And I just had a chance to sort of sit for a moment and visualize the trainees who asked questions and pointed out how hard it can be when their boss is overly harsh. And I just sort of visualized that, and that allowed me to calm down and give slightly better feedback, kinder feedback, more careful feedback. So we can impact that one. We can't impact it completely because we can be as clear as we can be and try to be as kind as we can be. But if it lands hard, it lands hard. And then finally, I talked a little bit about looking around and getting messages about whether I belong or don't belong, and what kinds, whether interactions send me a message of I belong or don't belong. And so student learning can really be undermined when we inadvertently or intentionally deliver messages that decrease their sense of belonging and safety in the group. So this was really a little bit of the flip side of some of the things I talked about in the last slide. So this time I'm going to pause and take questions throughout, and hopefully I'll still get through everything. Flexing your style with each mentee, how do you do that without fairness issues? You know, the honest truth is that each person is different, and we can be equitable and hold everyone to high expectations while still providing different types of support and different flexibilities. And so we want to be careful about favoritism and always taking care of one person's needs while ignoring the needs of others. But a lab doesn't work well when everyone is treated exactly the same. A lab works well when everyone is treated with respect, and that there is a set of rules and regulations that are applied equally but flexibly. How do you balance learning with the inherent need for productivity, especially as we move up the ladder and transition to the position as PI? I think that that's a really important question, and it's why I start with that slide that says we have to really think this through so that we can protect ourselves, but also be a good mentor. I think we do that by not taking on too much mentoring. We do that by setting healthy boundaries. You know, at NIH, I encourage our mentors who mentor summer interns, I'm like, help them plan a summer schedule that gets them away to workshops part of the time. They're at a workshop for 2 hours and you have a chance to attend to your own work for a little bit. I think you want to balance the time you spend with them with the time that you spend focused on yourself. You also want to be available and teach them things so that they get up to speed quickly. You want to give feedback promptly and early so that if they're doing things that are leading to even less productivity, you address it early. And as you move up the ladder, management becomes more important. The more management training you have before you become PI, the better off you will be. It's one of the biggest mistakes that we make. We think we don't need management training. It's like hubris. We're smart at science, doesn't make us smart at managing. And so take all the training you can. Are some previous webinars better than others for communication styles? Yes, you should watch the webinar on feedback and the webinar on leadership if you want to learn about communication styles. There's also a great book called Communication Styles at Work. What do you do if someone violates your boundaries? Ask something you don't really want to share with them. You should take a deep breath and pause for a moment. Ask yourself why they might be asking that question. And if it feels too personal for you, if it's about something about you, you can just say, that feels a little bit personal for me, and I'd rather not share that. I think that it helps when trainees know something about us and our lives, but they don't need to know every detail, and you have the right to say, oh, that's a little bit of a boundary crossing for me. But I would encourage you to ask yourself where the hesitation comes from and to think it through before you don't answer. Do you have advice for how to switch gears when the mentoring relationship is not going well? I mean, I do, and a lot of times I find myself having, I call it a reboot in the relationship. Ideally, we're giving feedback early and often and calmly all along so that we don't have to switch gears and reboot, but sometimes we really find ourselves in a, the trainee is in a bit of a hole with us. We're really not feeling very positive about their abilities. We should let them know that. And I recommend there a really calm, supportive set of discussion where you ask them for their thoughts on how things are going, what you might change to make things go better for them, but where you also share your expectations. My hope is that if we talk a lot about expectations and how to set the stage, that we might not have to reboot so much. The earlier we give feedback, the easier it is to reboot. I would love to be able to work with each student's wants or needs, but but if it's the first lab experience or professional experience, they may not have insight into what works best for them yet. You are really right about that. I find sometimes people say to me, you should ask the trainees what workshops they need. And I say, well, yes, but often they don't know what they need. So if I tell them they need resilience workshop at the start of the summer, then I'm going to ask that they sort of buy into that. And if I say, what do you need? And they say, oh, I don't need that. Well, I know they do. So you are the wise elder here. Even if you're just elder by a small amount of time, you are the wiser elder, and you should be helping them figure out what they need. But you also need to listen to them. And we also need to appreciate that students sometimes get into our lab because they didn't get into any other lab, right? Or this was where the program director placed them, or they thought they loved wet lab until they did it, or they thought they would love epidemiology, but then they started it and said, oh my God, you sit at a desk, I don't like that. So we also have to be prepared for them to know what they like and don't like, to realize that midway through, and then we have to flex and help them get the most out of it anyway, okay? If you spot other peers or coworkers being an ineffective mentor to their mentee, what do you do? I think it would be nice if you felt confident with that person to ask if you could grab a cup of coffee with them and share that you noticed an interaction that seemed difficult for their mentee, maybe some thoughts about how they could get some mentor training. I think that depends on how safe you feel in that situation. You also might, at times, you might want to go to the mentee and say, wow, that was a bit harsh, and I just want to make sure you're okay. I just want to check in with you. It really depends on the situation. How do you best mediate a relationship between trainees and a third party like a co-PI, especially when they're having a lot of friction? I'm gonna, I think, defer on that until we get later in the workshop. That's really, I think, a really maybe better discussed later. It also might be best discussed after we do Workplace Dynamics 1 this week. We're gonna do conflict and feedback, and it might be better discussed then. The name of the book about communication, one is Thanks for the Feedback, and the other is Communication Styles at Work. And you can email me and I'll send you the authors. In the past, I've had a situation where I would give the mentee instruction, but they would routinely try to go around me and interact directly with the PI. The PI would tell me I'm responsible, but still give directions. Yeah, this kind of mentoring triangle or triad happens a lot. The best way to deal with that is to talk to the mentee and ask them to please come to you first. Ask them if the PI gives advice to also chat with you about it, that it can be hard for everyone to be on the same page, and so communication is key. You also could sit down with your PI. If this happens once, you sort of have to say, well, the PI sometimes does that, but if this happens a lot, you need to sit down with the PI and be a little bit assertive about it. I'm going to take the questions on feedback later. I see a bunch of questions on feedback. So I'm going to take those later. What advice would you give for the first mentorship experience? I would give the advice to treat this like an incredible learning opportunity, to take as many workshops as you can, to journal about your experience so that you can help yourself see some of the good things that you did in the mentoring experience and do them again, make corrections midway through, find a sort of mentoring mentor, someone who has mentored before in the past that you can talk with. That's some of my advice. And this is going to be the last question, and then the feedback questions you'll post again later. Do you have suggestions for mentors who are international visiting fellows who mentor postbacks who are from the US? I feel like I have a lack of mentorship sometimes because of language barriers, so I'm worried if the postback thinks I'm not an effective mentor. I actually will answer that by giving you an observation, because I talk to a lot of NIH postbacks, and I would say that many of them share how much they value their mentor, many of whom are visiting fellows. I wonder if some of that is a little bit of a feeling of not fitting in and imposter fears from your side. And so let's hear the discussion about imposter fears and maybe bring that back up. So I'm not going to get through more material unless I move on, but leave these questions in there and I'll get back to some more. So I want to go now from this big setting the stage to a little bit of how to get started with someone. So we've asked this question of hundreds of NIH fellows. We've asked them to think about their first day in their current program, how they felt, what was going through their head, what was helpful, what was not helpful. We asked them to think about what others did or said that were helpful, and what were things people did or said that were not helpful, okay? And normally we would sit and do this, but we're not gonna do that, so I'm gonna share some things. One thing that really helps improve a mentoring relationship is making contact in advance, sending an email, welcoming them, telling them a little bit about what the experience is going to be like, letting them know where to go on the first day, right? So that they're not guessing, right? Some people have shared, I arrived at 8 thinking that might be the right time, but the lab starts at 10, so I sat on the floor outside for 2 hours. Make contact in advance and smooth all of that out. You want to take a little bit of time to get to know a bit about each other. You can share a little bit about your educational journey and a little bit about why you love the science that you love and why you're doing, what your goals are. And you can ask them some questions to get to know them a little bit. If this is a virtual mentoring this summer, obviously you can't show them around and make them comfortable, but in general, that's a really important thing. Sometimes people don't know where the bathroom is. They don't know where the refrigerator is. They don't know where it's okay to eat and where it's not okay to eat. And so you want to make them comfortable by showing them around. You also want to introduce them to colleagues. You want to say, hey, I want to introduce you to my summer intern, or this person's doing a rotation with us for grad school, or they're working with us as part of their work study. Introduce them by name and introduce them to people all around them, the people they're likely to bump into. I think if you're doing virtual mentoring this summer, you could still do that because they might be on Zoom meetings with other people. So maybe you could Zoom just the three of you together and you could introduce them to some other colleagues. I think you'll need to consider if you're doing remote mentoring, whether that's important or not. And so there's a whole lot of remembering that you were once a foreigner in a strange land, right? Meaning the lab in this case, right? And anything that you can do to be empathetic and remember that and provide them with information, right? These are our general hours. This is when we have lab meeting. I'll sit with you and help you understand at the beginning. Here's, we generally don't come in till this time, right? Anything you can do. You also want to make sure they have clear expectations, that they understand what you expect of them. The flip side is you need to know what they expect of you, and it's worth asking them that. What do you need from me, right? I think that's hard for them to answer at the beginning of the first week, but over time they might be able to answer that. And if it's a college student working part-time, they may need flexibility in hours when there are exams. If it's a summer intern and they take the bus and the bus schedule is inconvenient, they may need to come a little bit late. They may need you to answer questions about papers, right? It's worth finding out what they expect from you. But first, they need to hear what you expect from them. If they don't meet expectations that they didn't know about, they still dug a big hole and made a bad impression. And that happens a lot, where the mentor tells me I'm really upset because they weren't at lab meeting, and the mentee says, I didn't know I was supposed to go to lab meeting. So all kinds of things. The work and meeting schedules, if you have work expectations of hours, you need to let them know what they are. You also need to make sure that they are reasonable. If they have to attend a particular group meeting or a journal club or a branch meeting or a one-on-one meeting with you and the PI, one way to avoid those triangles is to have meetings between you and the PI. So you want to make sure they know all those meetings. Also, do you expect them to come prepared to your meeting with an agenda, or do you expect them to come with questions, etc.? You want to be clear about rules and regulations, how they should handle late arrivals, leave requests, last-minute schedule changes. That goes back to how do you want to be communicated to, right? Do you want them to text you? Do you want them to have a calendar where they put all of their workshops and webinars that they're going to go to on the calendar? If they are sick, how do you want to know that they're not coming in? If you have required training for them, you need to make sure they understand those expectations, whether that's responsible conduct of research training, animal use training, hazardous material training. You don't want them to bypass those trainings, then they make mistakes. Those mistakes bring scrutiny. You risk putting them in an unsafe situation, but you also risk putting yourself in an unsafe situation. You also want to make sure that they're aware of cultural norms in your group. If you all go to a particular seminar together, you don't want them to disappear for lunch a half hour before that seminar. Then the PI says, well, where's the summer intern or where's the postback? Maybe there's other cultural norms, like we have lunch together once a week with the PI, or we go to tea in our department at 3 o'clock on Thursdays. You want them, these are the things that convey that they belong. And remember, they need to feel like they belong to feel safe. If they're in a program at your school or at the NIH, maybe they have some requirements for the program. If they're at NIH, they might have other OITE requirements, and you want to make sure to talk about those, that you want to know about them, you expect them to take them seriously, but you also want to hear about them, right? Like I've known of cases where a mentee had to give a talk and they didn't tell their mentor, and then the mentor gets an email, oh, we'll see you at the talk, and they're like, how come I didn't know about this? You want to make sure to close the loop on those kinds of communication. So often when I ask a mentee, why didn't you tell that to your mentor? Why didn't you tell your postdoc that? They say, oh, I didn't want to bother her. Oh, I thought he was busy. Right? We have a hard time imagining, and by we here, I mean the grad students and postdocs, we have a hard time imagining that we're threatening, right? That we have power, because we often realize we don't have power when we think about our hierarchy. But in this case, you can be very, very threatening, and they won't tell you things unless you're clear about it. So these are all the kinds of things that you want to explore expectations. You then want to talk at some point. These are not meant to be in order. You can do this however you want. But you'll need to explain the overall context of your research and their project. And this isn't only one time. They will need lots of help wrapping their head around this, some less help, some more help, but you'll need also to give them resources to read, right? And you want to be clear about that. If lots of people like to send some reading in advance, it's interesting that in the workshop, some people say getting reading in advance was really comforting, and other people said, oh, getting reading in advance was really intimidating. And as we sort of explored that a little bit and unpacked that, it turned out to be both the amount of reading and the level of reading. So if you're going to send readings in advance, make sure that you think about your students' level and whether they're likely to be able to manage the reading that you've given them. You'll want to talk about research ethics, their notebook, record keeping, both in general, but also within the context of their work. How do you expect them to keep a notebook? And you should establish at the outset that you'll be taking a look at their notebook periodically with them so that it's a learning experience. And you'll want to pull out one of your notebooks that you're proud of and show them how you keep your notebook. You'll want to give them lots of time to reflect and ask questions, and you'll want to be available to talk some more. More introverted students might need to come back tomorrow with questions or email questions. More extroverted students might ask so many questions that you need to slow them down and say, let's just focus on some of this. So again, their personality and communication style will impact this a little bit. You want to, not in a testing way, so you don't want to just pepper them with questions, but in some way you want to follow up to confirm understanding and to make sure that they don't have more questions. So you might say, today I gave you a little bit of an introduction to our lab. What I'd like for you to do tomorrow is pretend that I'm your mentee, and I'd like you to come in and give me a 2 or 3 minute talk on our lab. You want to come up with ways to confirm understanding. And I think it's really a good idea to put some of the basic expectations about hours and what to do if you're going to be late, who to go to with questions, who your backup is, right? Maybe you want to get some work done and be productive, so you can't always be available. Well, who's your backup? Or you need to leave at 3 o'clock to pick up your kid at daycare. Who's your backup? Because your mentee might still be around. So you want to put all that in writing. So you should have a written document with some expectations. So that's what I have to say about setting expectations. Now I want to go into much more depth on those things that impact learning, okay? So mostly, what do we do day to day? We teach and we help our interns learn concepts. But importantly, we model the attitudes and behaviors we want to see. So if we want our trainees to keep a really clean lab notebook, we have to keep a really clean and clear lab notebook. If we want them to be respectful to everyone in the group, we have to be respectful. We want to model the attitudes and behaviors that we want them to see. You need to appreciate they are watching everything that you do. We give feedback to elicit either more of the same, i.e., you are on the right track, this is how you should set up a protocol, or to influence change. Here's what was done well here, but here's what needs to be different. You want to be able to step back and allow them to learn on their own and to learn through their mistakes. It's a really key thing that students learn when they're on the edge of their comfort zone and they learn from mistakes. If we keep students way in their comfort zone and enable them and sort of feed it all to them in baby steps, they never learn. But if we step away too far, maybe we make it too hard to learn. And so our goal is to push them a tiny little bit outside their comfort zone to help them learn. And when they make mistakes, to be there to help them learn through those mistakes. I encourage you to read the work of Dr. Carol Dweck. She wrote a book called Mindset Matters. You can just Google her and you will find her TED Talks. But she talks a lot about how we look at mistakes. And there are people with a growth mindset who look at mistakes as opportunities to learn. And then there are students who get really caught in needing to be perfect, and they have what Carol Dweck calls a fixed mindset, and they struggle to learn through mistakes. And they don't want to make mistakes, so they don't take risks. This, I have to say, was some of the, for me, although it was a quick read and a quick watch, it really changed my way of talking to people in my staff and in my lab when I had a lab about mistakes. So rather than like just trying to correct the mistake, I'm like, where's the learning? And that's actually become one of my favorite questions. I ask myself that, I ask my son that, I ask people in my office that, I ask trainees that, where's the learning? Okay, it was a terrible interaction, where's the learning? We want to, as we help students learn through mistakes, acknowledge the process and not only the outcome. The process is how well they did. So maybe in the end they messed up something, or maybe the experiment just didn't go well, but maybe they did make a mistake. At the end, they eluted the DNA into the waste beaker. I give that example because that happened when I was first running my own lab. I walked away for a little bit and we had done so well, everybody learning how to do plasmid preps, but I wasn't there when they had to elute it, and they eluted it into the wash bucket. So the outcome was lousy, but the process was excellent. They had followed so many steps well. So sometimes we have to acknowledge the process and not just the outcome. And then we have to acknowledge the emotion that goes along, right? When people are disappointed or embarrassed or frustrated or upset, I think we need to say, I appreciate that this is frustrating, and we still have to figure out what went wrong. But let's take a few moments to be in those emotions. So I think those are things that help people move and learn through mistakes. So if we keep in mind that our goal is to keep them safe so that they can help them feel safe so they can take risks and learn and make mistakes and learn through the mistakes, that's the beginning foundation of things. Now what I want to do is turn a little bit towards some things that impact student learning, those contextual factors that I talked about. And I'm going to start with this guiding principle that we are all hardwired to connect, and people are motivated by a desire to belong and grow, and they want to be in a positive environment built on mutual respect. Nobody learns in the middle of a fight, flight, freeze response. Another guiding principle that we need to keep in mind is while we can influence behavior, we can't make anyone do something they don't want to do. And so we really need to build an environment where we're modeling behavior and encouraging what we want to see. Growth requires the courage to be imperfect and to make mistakes. And most of our interns are still developing who they are. They are what we call emerging adults, and they are all certainly emerging scientists. So they are not ready to perform totally independently in such a high knowledge environment. So for most, they're in their 20s, right? Undergraduates and summer interns. Well, executive functioning, the ability to organize and juggle complex tasks, it develops into the late 20s. Our brain is still laying down myelin sheaths to help executive functioning all the way into the late 20s. This is also a time for all of our interns when their identities are being questioned and formed and reformed. They're figuring out who they are. Now, coincidentally, we might also be figuring out a little bit about who we are, right? Those of you who are grad students or postbacks, while you're mentoring, you're still sorting out separation from family, identities, etc. And I want to talk a little bit about identity. I'm going to pause here for one moment to adjust the heating in my office. I'm going to fall over from heat. So I'll be back in a second. There's nothing wrong with the webinar. Spring keeps showing up and then leaving, and my office doesn't, somehow it gets cold and stays cold. So I want to talk a little bit about those identities. And I have always believed that these kinds of discussions are best when we're all in a room and can talk with each other. But I think it's so important to think about identity and how identity impacts learning and mentoring. I'm going to try it this way, and you can all give me some feedback. And I apologize in advance if I use some language that maybe pokes a little bit, but I really think it's an important discussion. So let's just start by acknowledging that we all have many identities, and some we're incredibly proud of, at least most of the time or some of the time, and some we struggle with all or some of the time. Some we're worried about disclosing or having people find out, right? An LGBTQ student who is wondering, is this environment safe? Or a student who has a hidden disability. And some that we worry that others might judge us about. In fact, some we're certain that society has at times judged us about, right? Those of us who are white don't have to worry about being outside and jogging through a neighborhood. But people of color do, as we've learned in really hard ways recently. So sometimes we know that people will judge us or misjudge us, quite frankly, is the word that I should use. So we are a mix of identities. We are very proud of some we struggle with at times, some we're worried about sometimes, but not other times, and we carry all these identities around. And we carry them around some days more than others, in some contexts more than others. And a whole part of being safe is being able to bring our whole self into the workspace. When we ask students what identities they worry about, we get a really, really long list. First generation college student, community college student, first generation scientist, immigrant, children of immigrants, right? Somebody brought up their worries about being a mentor in terms of language barriers as a visiting scientist. Gender and gender identity. Maybe I want to tell my mentor that I prefer to use the pronoun they instead of he or she. Race and ethnicity. And of course, the coronavirus pandemic is showing us once again the incredible health disparities based on race and ethnicity. So this brings vulnerabilities into the research space as well. Sexual orientation, is this a comfortable place to come out, be out, talk about my girlfriend, or do I need to hide who I am? Socioeconomic status, right? The divide between people who've had all kinds of enrichment activities to expand their scientific understanding, and students who had to leave high school and go work to provide food for their family, so they couldn't do the science fair and all these extra activities, right? So that's another identity people worry about. Religion, disability, age, body type, political affiliation. These are just some. I'm sure that you, in thinking about yourself, might have others to put on the list. In thinking about trainees that you've mentored, you might have others to put on the list. The more I talk with students about mental health issues, anxiety, depression, obsessive compulsive disorder, learning disabilities, I realize how many students bring those hidden issues into the workplace, and they really worry, how do I talk to my mentor about this if I have to? So this matters to us as mentors because to be safe, we have to be who we are, and we have to feel comfortable as who we are. And some people say, I don't see color, I don't see all these things, I just see a scientist. But the honest truth is that it takes a lot of privilege to say I don't see color. Or me, as a generally healthy person, it's easy for me to say, well, you know, I treat everybody the same, whether they have a hidden disability or not. That's like a matter of privilege to be able to say these things. And so we really have to develop a sensitivity and an understanding and a comfort around identity and how identity can enhance relationships, but also be a barrier to quality relationships. We cannot understand fully someone else's life, but we can be open and appreciate that our lack of understanding might lead to blind spots. And so I think it's really important for us to talk about this when we talk about mentoring. And I want to talk about it in thinking about how we view others. And I want to say that in general, we have two groups, an in-group and an out-group. In-groups are identity groups with which we identify strongly and or have substantial experience with. So we might not be a part of that group necessarily, but we've spent a lot of time around people in that group. We feel very comfortable. We're willing to acknowledge what we know and don't know. We generally are comfortable asking questions. It's our in-group. An out-group is an identity group with which we don't identify or have substantial experience with. Maybe we grew up in a situation where we didn't have access to people from that community. Maybe we grew up being fed biases from our family members. And I'll give you an example of an out-group for me that I realized as I did more and more in the educational space. So I grew up in a community hearing a fair number of biases around people from Muslim backgrounds and Arab countries. And, you know, as a child, I hear things and I maybe am not old enough to even question them, but then I enter the workspace and I have a responsibility to grow and question these biases. And I realize every time I talk to somebody who's wearing a hijab, I'm too focused on the hijab to hear what they have to say. That's an example of an out-group bias getting in the way. Or maybe I shouldn't even use the word bias. I should just say that's an example of someone in the out-group, and it is getting in the way of an authentic relationship with them. And so when we notice that, our responsibility is to try to grow and learn. And so I read some books, I watched some movies, I asked some questions, I got online and learned what Muslim beliefs were, what the Quran was all about. And I learned and asked and taught questions. That doesn't mean that I understand everything about the experience of a Muslim in America, but it means that I've expanded a bit in my understanding. And there's less chance of that out-group experience getting in the way. So we all need to understand where our comforts and discomforts are. And that was just one example. All of us have examples, right? If we all sit quietly with ourselves and acknowledge that we're human, then I think we would acknowledge that to be human means to have bias. It means to have in-groups and out-groups. And there's a lot of data that shows simply reflecting on this helps us deal with it. It helps us do better. There is a wonderful website, I really love it, understandingprejudice.org. And there's another one, the implicit bias website, and I gave you links to both of them. The thing is that we have in-groups and out-groups. We sit in a society that's sending cultural messages. We hear them throughout our lifetime, and that leads to the potential for both unconscious bias and unconscious favoritism. And this can really impact mentoring interactions. There was a study done where scientists were sent emails, faculty members, I think, were sent emails from a fake trainee, not looking for a job, just saying, I'd like to come and talk with you about your work. And they had different names, an Asian sounding name, a white sounding name, Black, more traditionally Black culture sounding name, more traditionally Latinx sounding name. And then they just saw who did the faculty answer, right? And we'd love to think that the case was that they answered every student in the same rate, but they didn't. Right? There was bias. Those are unconscious biases, because if you ask most of those people, are you biased? They would say, oh no, I try to treat everybody with respect and kindness and care. And so we really want to understand the impact that that has on our mentoring. And the way to do that is for us to explore our biases, our language that might convey an unwelcoming tone, etc. One other element to understand in this regard is the issue of stereotype and stereotype threat. So a stereotype is a common generalization about the typical characteristics of members of a group. Sharon is a woman, so she's probably emotional. Sharon is a woman, so she's probably a great caretaker, right? And usually I ask people to put some out on the table. It gets very, very quiet in the room. Nobody wants to say these, but I'll put a couple out there into the Ethernet So-and-so is a German, probably very organized. Asian, good in math. And unfortunately, even positive stereotypes like that can have a negative consequence, right? If you are perceived to be good in math and nobody gives you any assistance in math and you could use a little assistance, it can get in the way. There are all kinds of culturally negative stereotypes about Black people as not good in science, good in sports. I mean, you name it, right? Stereotypes abound. They distort our perception and impact our judgment. When we make judgments about individuals and they're driven by stereotypes, even if we try not to hear them and we're unaware they're driving our perceptions, then things get in the way. So buying into stereotypes can really get in the way of mentorship, even positive stereotypes. So it's important for you to think about the stereotypes that you have heard. And you know, all of us come from the families and the cultures we came from, and my family has a whole set of biases. And I'm not responsible for having heard them as a child, but I am responsible for questioning them as an adult. And so we really want to be cautious. And I think that sometimes we are so unaware of them that we say something inadvertent that's unfortunate, and then that leads to fear of saying something else, and a barrier is put up. And suddenly we're not our authentic self with someone. But if we accept that we all have to learn and grow in our language, and we all have to learn and grow in how we interact and engage in a very multicultural, diverse environment, then this becomes a real opportunity for learning as opposed to an opportunity for fear. And so I encourage you to learn a little bit about stereotypes, and in particular, to learn about something called stereotype threat. Stereotype threat, and this book, Whistling Vivaldi, is an excellent book to read. Stereotype threat is when a member of a community is aware of a stereotype, and because they are afraid of confirming that stereotype, they withhold and hang back in a group. So for example, women have heard for a long time that they're not as good as men in math and science. So if you are a woman in a predominantly male lab that does biophysics, and you're aware of that stereotype of women not excelling in biophysics, then you don't want to ask questions because you're afraid of proving that stereotype. You don't want to take a risk because you're afraid of confirming that stereotype. Whistling Vivaldi is a great book that helps us look into how stereotype threat can get in the way, what stereotypes we might have about individuals. And it's a great place if we come at this, not from, oh, I'm bad because I have bias and stereotypes, but I'm human, so I have to learn about these biases and stereotypes. Then I think there's a real opportunity here. The last week in May, we will hold a workshop on microaggressions and stereotypes, particularly related to the coronavirus pandemic. It will be on the 26th in the afternoon, so people on the West Coast can watch. And I hope you join me, because I think that we all have an opportunity to do some learning in this regard right now. And I know that we want to support everyone in our community as we all return to work. And so it will be a great opportunity to learn some things. I'm going to pause here because that's a sort of intense topic. And so I'm not going to go through all of the questions, but if there are any questions or comments about what I said around identity and stereotypes, I know it can be hard to hear somebody saying a bunch of stereotypes out loud, and especially you can't see me and many of you don't know me. So I just want to pause here and give people a chance maybe to reflect or share for a moment. All right, I don't see anything in the chat box, and so I am going to move on then. One of the things that really impacts learning are imposter fears. which some of you may have heard about before as imposter syndrome. I really prefer to call it imposter fears. And I talk about that in some of the other workshops that I've done. But I think syndrome implies something wrong with you, and fear is just a normal, healthy emotion that's sending a signal that, oh, I might be at a little bit of risk. So I prefer the language of imposter fears. I talk about them right after talking about stereotype threat, because we know that stereotype threat drives imposter fears. And the data suggest that people of color and people underrepresented in the scientific space experience imposter fears at higher rates than some communities in science, although in general, imposter fears happen for a lot of people. So imposter fears are the feeling of phoniness in people who believe that they're not intelligent, capable, or creative, despite evidence of high achievement. I talk about imposter fears a lot in the resilience workshop that I did on the 1st of April. Let's look at the causes of imposter fears. By the way, Pauline Rose Clance is the first scientist who defined imposter. She called it imposter syndrome. She's the first person. She's done a lot of research, and you can check out her website. So we know 6 causes, actually. I've mentioned 5 here. One is being a student. So it makes so much sense that new interns come into their lab and they would suddenly feel like they don't belong, and that you're going to ask them a question and suddenly realize they don't belong and kick them out. Imposter fears happen when we're in an environment that feels foreign to us. And so if we show up in a new lab, it's foreign. If we've come from another part of the country to be in that lab, it feels even more foreign, right? And so 2 things cause imposter fears that we really can't control very much: being a student and coming into a new environment. Another thing that causes imposter fears are organizational culture and messaging. Even the word scholar, sometimes, we have so many programs, we call them our scholars. Well, that's a heavy word. It sort of implies you are wise and know a lot. There's a mug at NIH. It says NIH, lots of really smart people, right? Like, I'm struggling to do my calculations right now, for the buffer I need to make, but this is a really smart place with a lot of smart people. All the organizational messaging around things like that can cause imposter fears. Stereotype threat, as I just discussed, cause imposter fears. So we really see a lot of imposter fears in students who are underrepresented in the sciences. And then messages from family and childhood. If you brought home a 95 and someone in your family said, why didn't you get 100? That perfectionism, that push to be perfect, drives imposter fears. If on the other hand, what you heard was, oh, you're not the smart one, you're the funny one, your brother's the smart one, that drives imposter fears, because you've heard that you're not smart enough. So sometimes messages from culture, but sometimes messages from families. The other thing that causes imposter fears are working in creative fields. And if you think about it, science is sort of creative, and so I probably should add that to the list. Many artists have talked about imposter fears. In fact, Maya Angelou, the incredibly important poet and author, published 12 or 13 books, and there's a tape of her speaking on YouTube where she says, even in the 12th book, I thought, this one is where people will find me out. They'll realize I'm not really a great author. They'll figure me out. So imposter fears are caused by a lot of different things. Another thing to know about imposter fears, look at these data. 70% of all people experience imposter fears at some point in their educational and work journey. I think sometimes mentors feel imposter fears when the mentee shows up and they think, uh-oh, I won't be able to explain this, and now my mentee will realize I'm not ready to be a mentor, right? A little bit of imposter fears happen on both sides. So we might experience imposter fears ourselves. We might be experiencing them right now. We might love someone or many someones who experience imposter fears, so we really want to understand how to handle these. And we might teach or train someone or many someones who experience imposter fears. Once we look at what behaviors imposter fears cause, we realize how much they can get in the way of a good mentor-mentee relationship. So if you're feeling imposter fears, your confidence drops and your stress goes up. You start second guessing yourself. You don't want to ask for help because you don't want to show that you don't know, because you're afraid if you ask for help, people will realize what you don't know and they'll figure out you don't belong. So you start to hold back. You don't volunteer for assignments. You don't apply for a competitive position. Someone might say, does your summer intern want to present a poster? And you want them to say yes, but they, because of imposter fears, oh, I don't want to do that. So you hold back. It can make students very sensitive to critical feedback or developmental feedback. And all of this, if imposter fears are really, really growing and large for a student, they engage in self-sabotaging behavior. I don't feel like I belong. That causes me to feel despondent and unmotivated. I think I don't belong. I feel despondent, so I won't read this paper. Well, then I wasn't prepared, so I went to a meeting with my mentor. I didn't do a good job. I got some hard feedback. See, aha, I don't belong. Self-sabotaging behavior. If you don't talk with your trainees about imposter fears and you don't watch for them in your mentees, then they may be holding back and you think it's because they don't care, or you think it's because they don't know, but actually it's because they are afraid to speak up right now because of imposter fears, and you're losing out on the very best of them. So it's really important for you to keep imposter fears in mind. When someone seems disengaged, rather than giving them feedback, you're disengaged and I don't think you care, maybe ask a question. You seem hesitant to speak up. What's happening? Is there anything I can do to help? What's behind your not being prepared? Can you let me know what's going on? So we want to work to minimize imposter fears. And the honest truth is all of these things, some of them are directly related to imposter fears, but all of them build student confidence and all of them are good for making people feel safe in a learning environment. So you want to validate their place in your group. All those things like including them in lunch and inviting them to meetings and introducing them to people, that validates their place. You want to normalize the new learner experience. You're going to make mistakes. Even when you're not a new learner, you're going to make mistakes. You want to make it clear that lab meetings should be overwhelming, right? They shouldn't understand all of it. So let's focus on getting better each week or learning a little bit more each week. I talked already about focusing on process and not just on outcome, and you should be hammering that home, right? So when you give feedback, don't focus just on the outcome, focus on the process. Focus on a growth mindset approach. So read the literature of Carol Dweck and talk about mistakes as a way to learn. Model that by when you make a mistake, talking about it. We talked a lot about how do you build confidence. We build confidence by developing skills in low stress environments. So don't set them up and put them into high stress environments right away. Don't make them the standard bearer, right? So don't ask questions about, your community, what do they think, right? People often will say to me, well, what does the gay community think about this? And I'm like, don't know. I just know what Sharon Milgram thinks about this, right? What do women think about this policy or that policy, right? We want to be careful not to make people the spokesperson for their group because it really identifies the group. You want to avoid comparisons to other students and name dropping of prestigious institutions. Students who come from community colleges often come from community college because it's a very reasonable economic alternative. Yet if we're constantly name dropping fancy name schools, then it makes students realize or think, oh, wait a minute, they're judging me based on where I am going to school. Encourage people to participate in the training community and in wellness activities. These are two anecdotes to imposter fears. The minute students hear from others that this is a common experience for new learners, that it's a common experience for students in high knowledge environments, then they're not so alone and they don't feel any shame around it. And then they can work with them a little bit better. If you talk to them about it, it can help a lot. Not making the whole discussion about you, but sharing that you've made mistakes, that you have imposter fears at times, that you sometimes can feel really stressed when you're in a new environment. Anything you can do to normalize the experience helps a lot. And then finally, if you really are seeing a student who appears to be unmotivated and unexcited and unreachable, and you've tried all strategies you can think of, you should encourage them to talk to program leadership, and you should reach out to program leadership, not to complain, but to ask for guidance and help. Hey, can you give me some thoughts on how to support my mentee a little bit better, right? We want to assume the best in people, and we want to try to decrease the barriers to their success, not assume that they don't care and therefore give up. So a little bit more in that regard is this whole concept of micro affirmations. So when we look at making students feel safe and included in a learning environment, this concept of micro affirmations comes up, and I love it. Student success is the product of thousands of small gestures extended daily by caring, supportive educators sprinkled throughout the institution who enact a talent development philosophy, i.e., we are here to take a student's abilities and develop them. Micro affirmations are small acts to foster inclusion, comfort, and support for people who may feel unwelcome or invisible in an educational environment. So think about times when someone really made you feel that you belong. What did they do? Did they ask you a question on the way out of seminar and actually pause and wait for you to answer? Did they introduce you to the seminar speaker and invite you to sit in and actually involve you in the conversation? Did they point out what you did well, ask you what you did well? What is it that made you feel really included and really supported? Those are the things you want to do for others. And this is a great article. So I want to talk a little bit about tools of being affirming. And the first is active listening. Active listening is concentrating really fully on what's being said. Generally, we're preparing to speak. We're not actually concentrating. It's putting away our phone. It's turning away from our laptop. It's really sitting across from somebody, engaging with them. It's really not judging them as they speak. It's trying to put that off and trying to understand their experience, their feelings and views, especially as students are explaining how stressed they're feeling or how unsuccessful they're feeling. We don't want to just say, it'll be okay, you're doing great, and move on, because we haven't given them a chance to share how they're feeling. So active listening is holding back from problem solving long enough for them to talk about how they're feeling. It's about using questions and soft interpretations to increase understanding rather than thinking we understand. If I hear you, you're saying this. My understanding is you need more help in this, or my understanding is you feel you did really well and you'd like to do the next experiment on your own. And maybe they'll say, no, I feel like I did well. I want you to watch, but say less, right? So it's really being engaged with the person. And there are some key elements: encouraging them, asking questions, restating things, summarizing, validating, thank you for coming to talk to me, etc. You know, as I talk about this, I realize just how time consuming it is to be a good mentor. And we started off by saying there's this tension between mentoring and getting work done. And I think we really have to honor that. The honest truth is, as we get better at this, it's less time consuming than it seems. But at the beginning, as we're developing these skills, it is really time consuming. So one thing, to go back to that question about how do we deal with that tension, I think one thing is to ask, are we really ready for this time-wise? Yes, we need to develop skills. Maybe a summer internship, mentoring someone for a short period of time, a semester or a summer, is better than full-time. Or maybe we want to share some mentorship responsibilities, because it really does take time. I learned two concepts in a workshop that was actually done by the Parent Encouragement Program, or PEP, here in the area. It was a facilitator from PEP, and I asked her to come talk about mentoring high school students. And she taught the next two slides, and I loved them. And she talked about the difference between being encouraging and discouraging. When we are encouraging, we communicate that we recognize, accept, and trust that our trainee has the ability to learn and grow. And when we're discouraging, we communicate that we don't recognize, accept, or trust them, and we don't believe they have the ability to learn and grow. And sometimes because we're frustrated, we respond in a really discouraging way. And I see myself do this. I always wish to take it back. Something like, I can't believe this is what you call a good first draft. But do you really think this looks like a good protocol? Right? We're frustrated, and instead of pausing, taking a deep breath and trying to help them see what needs to change, we blurt out what comes to our mind first, which often starts with, I can't believe. But instead, if we're encouraging, we might say something like, with effort, you can turn this first draft into an excellent poster. Or this is a good beginning on your lab notebook, but it will take some work to bring it up to the level we're hoping for. We're conveying, we think you can do this. Yes, it will take work, but we think you can do this. And then they introduced the concept of being empowering versus enabling. And I'm going to skip right to the suggestion. So someone asked, your mentee has to do lab meeting, and you're all stressed about it because you feel like it reflects on you, not only them, but on you as well. And you want it to go perfectly. And they give you a set of slides, and ooh, they need some work. And you say, here, your slides need work, use mine instead. That is enabling someone, right? You essentially took control and you provided so much help and support that you removed the need for them to learn on their own. You did it for them, right? Here, modify mine. To really empower someone to learn, you might say, I made suggestions on your slides. I'd like you to work on them. I'd like to see another draft in a few days. You essentially turn control over to them. They have to make suggestions. They have to make decisions. They have to work through the material. They have to find and use resources to tackle the problem. Now, you might help them find the resources. You might say, here's a great article on making posters, or you might say, I know the program has a workshop on making posters. To empower someone takes time. You can't do things last minute with students, right? Because last minute we tend to enable, here it's tomorrow, just take this. Empowering means we start early and we really try to give them as much chance to learn. Somebody who works with our high school students says all the time, the person who does the work does the learning. And I don't think you need to learn how to do a poster right now. You've learned that long ago. So the person who does the work does the learning, worth keeping in mind. And then a couple of other things about being affirming and helping people learn. Think about something called a strengths-based approach. That means rather than starting with what went wrong, we start with what went right. And you might do this every day at the start. So what went well today? Then at the end of the week, what went well this week? What are you satisfied with or proud of in relation to your week, your poster, your meeting, etc.? I just wanted to give you some phrases to make this seem actionable. You might follow up after they sharing what they think they did well with your observations on what they did well. And you want to be clear and precise. Saying things like, in general, you had a good week is not helpful. You were careful in your experiments. Your calculations were done accurately. You asked for help when you needed it. You want to make those kinds of very precise observations. So you ask them first, you might follow up, and then you might say, and where might you wish to grow? So you've taken a strengths-based approach. You've conveyed, I believe in you, you're learning, I see it, and where's some more learning? Another thing is to affirm feelings. We like to ignore the feeling part. I think scientists aren't that emotionally agile. Maybe I'll speak for myself and say I'm not so emotionally agile. Some of my wellness staff tell me that scientists sometimes would love to be heads on sticks, right? We don't have body needs, we don't have emotional needs, we just think things through. Sometimes it is so much more helpful to say to someone, I know this is frustrating, that you have to do it again. And we still have to do it again. So let's talk through a strategy. Or I imagine that you feel embarrassed about this. Or I appreciate that you might be upset about this feedback. Affirming that we acknowledge the difficult feelings that go along with this. Another one is to recognize and validate their agency in processing the experience, i.e. asking why they made the decision that they made, or why do they think something happened? And I gave you some examples. What led you to decide to do the experiment that way? I know I like to start with, why did you do that? And that's not as calm as, can you talk me through your thinking in this? What led you to decide? Or I see the jealous smeared. Why do you think that happened? That conveys that you think they have ideas worth hearing. Okay. Another great thing about recognizing and validating agency is you can recognize and validate their agency in finding resources. You can't be the person who teaches them everything, because you have responsibilities and you have to have boundaries. So you might say, are there resources in the grad school that you could be using to learn this? Are there online tools that could help you with lab math? What do you think you can do to figure this out? So that's another tool. And the fourth is reinforcing positive attitudes and behaviors and the use of resources. When you see positive behaviors, point them out. You stayed positive even though we hit a few bumps in the experiment. You went back and recalculated when we realized there was a mistake. I'm really glad that you reached out to so-and-so to have your slides edited before we met. Your effort really paid off. That doesn't mean that you're not going to then give them some input about things they still need to change. But it means that you first acknowledged how well they did in coming to this point. And then you take them further. It's like you acknowledge where they got to, and then you work to bring them further. Some of this is not words, it's also our meta communication. Right? So I just want to remind you that our communication is not just our words. It's all the nonverbal cues that we send, the paralanguage, right? That's our tone, body language, etc. All of this carries meaning. It can either enhance what we say or negate what we say. And if somebody's upset and you lean towards them and you make eye contact, not like creepy staring at you eye contact, but you really see them and look at them, that conveys caring. If you say, oh, don't worry about it, while you roll your eyes and turn away, your body language negated your words. So give some thoughts to your nonverbals and your paralanguage. I'm going to go ahead and pause here and take some questions. I hope the people who lost audio got it back. I wish I can send this webinar to my grad program mentors. Thank you. There are PIs who take this webinar and it will be up, and you could share, hey, I learned some really interesting things in this workshop that I think is going to help me be a better mentor. And if you want the link, I'd be happy to share it. Regarding meta communication, do you know of any resources for people who have resting bitch face? People often think I'm angry even when I'm not. That's a really interesting thing. I also, sometimes people will say, why are you so angry? And I'm like, I'm not angry. I'm just feeling a lot of energy at the moment. I think it's a combination of body language. I think we want to pause a little bit and maybe journal about where we got messages that smiling wasn't a good idea, where we got messages that make us feel stressed. I think some of it really is just our face and facial expressions, but I wonder if underneath that is a little bit of a not wanting to share how we feel. I'm really not an expert in that, but I do know that, it's how people perceive us that sometimes is the issue, right? Not really how we are, it's how we're perceived. And if we're frequently perceived in a different way, we want to ask, what part of that do we bring to the table? Now, sometimes there really are unconscious biases, all kinds of issues around cross-cultural communication. But I think I would probably start, and when people say that to me, I usually stop to think, well, how am I sitting? What was I saying? Did I repeat things a lot of times? I clench my jaw, which really does make me seem sort of unwelcoming. And so sometimes I have some awareness that it's me. Sometimes I feel like it's some unconscious bias about powerful women in the workplace. And so you'll have to think about that a little bit. About meta communication, what is the difference between sitting across a desk or next to them? I do think many people believe that it's much more welcoming to sit next to someone, not across a desk from someone. The flip side of that is that in this, we need to have boundaries, and sometimes we get a little bit close. It can make people uncomfortable. I actually tend to like to talk to mentees across a round table, not my sort of, well, messy, but sort of a powerful looking desk. That I think is really intimidating. But I don't usually sit next to people. I sit across from them, but I do try to convey some sense of welcoming by leaning forward. I put my phones away. I really, I'm not sure I think it matters so much, and some people are much more comfortable across the table. I know that I am. I didn't check every link. I apologize for that, and thank you for pointing that out. I would Google micro affirmations and see what you can find, and I'll also look myself and get it in an email out to the group. How do we deal with both being a mentor and having imposter fears? Well, that happens to so many people. Someone is looking up to you, and that can really poke your imposter fears. Plus, it's a new experience sometimes, right? And new experiences drive imposter fears. So what we do is we take care of ourselves. We practice self-care. We acknowledge our own imposter fears. We talk to our mentor about our imposter fears. Maybe we even share with our student that, hey, I'm a little nervous about this. I want you to have a great summer, so I'm a little nervous about this. We own our own. We name it so we can tame it, and we keep working to learn to be a good mentor. But I think that it's really a combination of those things. How to get over a mentor's betrayal so it doesn't change my relationship with a mentee. I think a lot of times, I talked about this in the Managing Up and Mentoring workshop last time. Sometimes I think we're really damaged by something that happened in the mentoring space, and we carry that baggage like it's heavy rocks. It comes with us everywhere. We couldn't trust one mentor. We were betrayed by one mentor, so we can't trust any mentors, and it clouds the way we mentor others. And I think the way to deal with that is to process it and talk about it, whether that be in student health, with a counselor or therapist in the community, if it's a really big betrayal. I think we really have to give ourselves space to process that. You can listen and watch the old webinars on our website and on our YouTube channel. They get moved slowly from one to the other once they're closed captioned. While we organize as small groups and have social media accounts, we at sometimes encounter message feeds that are intimidating, bullying, mimicking. If it's how do we deal with that? Should we report it to our mentor, adjust, and live with it? It's interesting because psychological safety, and I know I summarized a really long question, psychological safety comes in part from the environment, but I do think that as we are looking at each other's social media, that can either make us feel more or less comfortable. I think if someone in your research group is posting things that are intimidating, perceived as unwelcoming, that you should seek advice from people that you trust. If you feel that it's someone you could talk with, maybe sharing how you experience their posts would be helpful. At the beginning around setting boundaries, I said I would not be on social media. I don't follow my staff on social media. All my social media, I am very aware that people know me. So on Instagram, I post food and I post a lot of things about Orange Theory and working out. At NIH, I post on my Twitter account, I post things thinking I'm seen as someone from NIH. And I think all of us need to think a lot about our boundaries around social media. And as you move up the food chain to be a mentor and a supervisor, you'll want to be aware of that. Since it's difficult to remain professional and still have deep personal conversations, how do you recommend to best make a mentee feel safe? I actually recommend not thinking about deep personal conversations, but more, so for example, if someone is struggling with some really serious family issues and you say, I want to talk with you. It seems that you're stressed, and this week you were late and you weren't prepared, and I'm worried about what's happening. And they start to say, here's what's happening. My mother is sick and she's in hospice care, and this is going on and that is going on. You acknowledge that. That's a lot of hard things, and thank you for sharing that. But you don't get into, you're not their counselor, you're not their parent, you're not their aunt, their uncle. You're a professional mentor relationship, and you help them find resources to deal with that, but you stay away from the deep personal conversation. Likewise, sometimes trainees come to me and say, my postdoc mentor is sharing with me all these kinds of things about their divorce, and it's just stressing me out, right? Likewise, you don't share your deep personal things. You find the appropriate place to process that. Okay, so some other resources. I'm having some trouble with resource links. Oh, you know why? I sent you a PDF. Those don't work because it's a PDF. I will send the actual PowerPoint. That's the problem. All right. You mentioned about maintaining space and being welcoming at the same time. How much distancing is professional and welcoming at the same time? Google says 3 feet. Huh, I actually didn't know that. And I suspect that in my office where the seats are arranged is probably about 2.5 to 3 feet apart. You know, we all have different feelings about personal space. If somebody's been assaulted, personal space is a harder issue for them. Culturally, some cultures hug and come close very quickly. Some cultures are very stay back. Some families within a culture, in my family, we never hugged. So when people hugged me at first, I was like, whoa, wait a minute, right? So it's all personal. We as leaders need to be aware that our actions can be overinterpreted and misinterpreted. So we try, I've tried as I've thought more and more about hugging in the workplace to, if a student makes a move towards something more than a handshake, I will decide in that moment how to respond. I usually will do a very quick professional type hug. That might be more difficult for a man to do. If I think a student might need or want a hug, I might say, would a hug be helpful, right? We all have to decide how we're going to maintain those boundaries and space. And sometimes we have to apologize, and sometimes we maybe think about it later and wish we had done it a little bit differently. All of these are great principles for being a perfect mentor. It makes me feel overwhelmed. Yeah. Could you share thoughts on where to start and how to improve along the way? You know, it's interesting you say that. Thank you for putting that out there. It makes me feel stressed to give this workshop because I am not the perfect mentor. And I have to mentor people in my office all the time, and I am imperfect. We are all imperfect. And we can't do all of this ever. This isn't meant to be, you have to use all of this. This is meant to throw at you a whole lot of different things, and you get to pick and choose. So think about it. Today is a big giant water hose, but you're going to decide which parts to drink from. You're going to say, wow, that part on identity I'd like to think about. Or you're going to say, oh, I could be sort of intimidating. My communication style can be intimidating. I want to learn about that. So I'm sorry it makes you feel overwhelmed. Ideally, this would be over 6-8 hours in the classroom, maybe over 2 times with lots of discussion where people would point out their strategies. And so I think that this is a little bit of an imperfect way to deliver this material, but I hope you can think about it as I'm giving you a toolkit, and you will learn this toolkit forever over time, and you'll keep practicing. That's why I said sharpening, right? I'm still sharpening my mentoring skills. So I hope that helps a little bit. How do you manage interactions with toxic trainees that are constantly seeking attention? It's very important to get advice from supervisors in situations where trainees are crossing boundaries, where they are demanding excessive time, where they have extra needs. It's important sometimes if your PI isn't helpful, but they're in a program, you want to talk to the program leadership. You know, when we talk to students who mentor trainees, when we talk to NIH fellows who mentor trainees that we pay for, we say, please come to us soon, early, right? We want to help before little problems become big problems. And so you want to reach out and get advice. When the mentoring is going well, you can learn by trial and error. When you have a feeling this is not going well, And I want to make adjustments, but also, you know, it's a two-way street. You have to do a good job, but so does your mentee need to do a good job, right? They need to be respectful too. You need to seek advice as soon as it doesn't feel right. There's a long question about choosing PIs and how PIs view their mentoring skills. And I'm going to encourage you to watch the workshop from last week, Managing Up, which is a lot about personality types and mentors. This goes on to say that sometimes someone is a good mentor with one type of person and not another, and there is some truth to that. Really good mentors flex their style and do their best with everyone, but you'll want to pay attention to how each person interacts with you to make sure that they're a good mentor for you. One size does not fit all in mentoring. It's difficult for me to take on a new trainee who is being difficult to their own mentor and others. I see that they're mean and challenging. How do I find the compassion to do this? You know, I think that we all need to decide what level of our career we're at. You know, when I was early in my career as a faculty member, I was very cautious about taking risks with trainees. But then I reached a point where my lab was fairly large. It ran itself in some ways. We had some good habits and behaviors and ways of doing things, and I could take some risk. It is really up to you to think carefully about what you can and can't do, whether you should take on someone who has struggled before. You should appreciate that maybe it wasn't them, it was the environment, but you also need to ask yourself, is this the time for me? The question here is hugging appropriate with opposite sex mentors. I think that it isn't whether it's same sex or opposite sex, it's the person and I think you should never assume that hugging is okay. I think that we all should probably assume that hugging in the workplace is something that we need to be much more cautious about. And I've really changed in this. It's interesting, I never hugged much growing up, and then I took on this job and somehow it became more natural for me to hug. And then I started working in our anti-harassment program and I started to realize maybe they're not so welcome by everybody. I think that, and you know, I guess we're not going to do handshakes, and right now we're not going to hug anybody anyway. Maybe handshakes are going away. I think this will be an evolving thing. Maybe we show that we care by high-fiving in the air or with a fist bump towards somebody. I think we're all going to need to play around with that a little bit and figure it out. How do we deal with the appearance of favoritism when there may be someone we get along with better than others naturally? You know, I think what we do is we focus a lot on how much professional feedback and input we give people, and we realize that our friendships need to be out of work and not in work. So sometimes I have people in my office where I think I could be good friends with them, but then I think, oh, I'm their boss, and I have really tried to balance that. And the more I'm a boss, the less I decide to take risks in that case. It doesn't mean that I don't share with people about my life or hear about their life, but I don't go to movies or concerts. I generally, when I have meals with people, it's either when we're on work travel, when it makes sense, or it's when I do it with everybody or invite everybody. So I think we want to be careful about favoritism by setting the best boundaries that we can. It's fine to share this as broadly as you want. As a mentee, how can I bring up certain aspects mentioned which I believe would work best for me without giving the impression that I don't think my mentor's mentoring style is good enough? It's a great question. You know, it's interesting, whenever I teach about mentoring, I know that it's also being received from the perspective of being a mentee. And I think just like you as a mentor want your trainee to be able to come to you and say, can I share some things that might help me succeed better here? My hope would be that you're in a lab where you could have that conversation with your PI or mentor. And so you would ask for a chance to talk, and you might start by pointing out some of the things that are really positive and acknowledge and show gratitude, right? I acknowledge that you've provided me with a lot and I'm really appreciative. And then you'd want to say, there are some things though where some small changes might help me. Would you be open to a discussion? And so there's a workshop on assertiveness and a workshop on managing up that might help. Tips or suggestions for how to make a mentee comfortable in a remote situation and build rapport and get to know each other. Yeah, I've been thinking about that a lot. I have some new people working with me and I'm going to take on some more new people. And I've decided that I am going to have some meetings that are very, very focused on work. And then I'm going to say, but normally we'd bump into each other and we'd have a few minutes to chat, and this would just sort of naturally happen. And we're going to need to be a little bit more intentional about it. And so let's grab coffee together at 10:15. You bring whatever you're going to bring. I'll bring whatever I'm going to bring. And let's be on Zoom, just the two of us, and try to get to know each other. Another thing that I think has worked really well, some of our wellness advisors recommended it and I decided to give it a try. So I would suggest starting meetings with a few things about more personal. What's something that you did fun in the last few days? Or what's something that you learned in the last few days? Just some things, and then you share as well. So it's your turn to share what's something fun that you did. And I think that may build some comfort remotely. I would not use the phone. I would ask them to please turn on their camera. I would be clear that you appreciate that they might have to share, they might be sharing an apartment, so it might be in their bedroom. They could use a virtual screen, but you don't really care. And I've noticed when I tell that to trainees, they will mostly turn on their camera, and then it's much easier to connect. If you tried to talk with your PI about letting you mentor and asking that they not micromanage everything, and the PI still does not back off, you know, sometimes we have to accept what is and a less than perfect situation, and we have to decide if this is something we can let go of. And it's something we can't let go of, then we really want to try to talk again. We want to talk to the mentee, but we don't want them to be a pawn between the two people. And so I think sometimes we have to realize that we can't change the situation. We can only change ourselves and our response to the situation. Is there a good way to balance motivating and pushing forward and pushing mentees to do hard work and providing a safe, supportive environment? You know, my hope would be if we provide a safe, supportive environment that they will push. Not only will we push them, but they will be pushing us and we will be pushing each other together. And I don't know that that's always true, but as students get more and more confident, that is most certainly true. And so I guess I would say that we start by building a safe, supportive environment. We start with baby steps. We build on every success. When we give them feedback about how well they're doing, we're also intentional about saying, let's see if we can't do a little bit more. But I think safe and supportive comes first. We don't want to put the bar up really high and say, jump and hopefully you'll make it. We want to say, here, let me help you make it. I'm going to help you jump, or I'm going to give you a lift. But we do want to take off we want to give less and less help as we move on. And we need to be intentional about that. I am a mentee and a postdoc who recently transitioned from graduate school. What would you suggest a mentee admit to their PI about having imposter fears? I think if it's getting in the way and you're not responding to emails and you're not speaking up in lab meeting and you're worried, it might be worth meeting and saying, hey, I just want to let you know I am struggling a bit with confidence. I have some imposter fears. That by itself isn't as helpful as saying, and here's what I'm doing to address them. But I actually think the better suggestion, rather than talking to them, is if you identified them early enough, is to start talking to somebody else and planning baby steps to work with them and around them in the research space. You know, you don't have to tell your PI everything. Sometimes it's really helpful to clear the air and share what's going on, but you have to feel safe to do that. So if you feel safe, I really encourage you to do that. But if you don't feel safe, I don't encourage you to do that. How do we identify if we have an intimidating personality? Yeah. You know, I realized that if I had listened to people early on saying things like, why are we arguing? If I wasn't so defensive about hearing that, I might have realized I had a little bit of an intimidating personality. And again, I think some of that is some unconscious bias about women and, you know, that women aren't supposed to be quite as forceful, but some of it is my own style. The best way to look at our style and get awareness of it is that book, Work Styles at Work, or Communication Styles at Work. It's written by Bolton and Bolton. And again, if when you Google it, you can't find it, just send me an email. It doesn't bother me. I answer most emails pretty quickly. If you don't get an email from me within a day or two, just send it again and say, hey, Sharon, just want to bring my email up to the top. I'm going to do feedback in another workshop because I have a lot of slides and it's an important topic. I have a feeling that none of us are going to be fully ramped up and back to work. And so I'll try to do it. I'll schedule it for next week. It'll just be Sharpening Your Mentoring Skills Part 2. I will take lots more questions. I will bring all the links to the books. I'm sorry, I should have done that. You asked a lot of great questions. It gives me some ways to reflect on things, and maybe then we'll tie the feedback part to some small group activities and things. I just think that it's 4 o'clock now and people are going to have to start getting off, and I have another meeting pretty soon. So I'm going to skip that and I'm going to end up, I just want to leave you with a couple of images. And those of you who heard me talk about resilience saw this before, but this is just a great thing to keep in mind. So there's a jackal. The jackal's going after lunch, and you know, the first thing that comes to mind is like aggression and power and hierarchy and force. Look at those giraffes. I mean, I can't help but smile. I happen to love giraffes. They're all over my office, quite frankly. They're all over my house. But look at that. I mean, it just sort of makes you want to go, aw. And probably giraffes can be aggressive, but they also look so curious and calm. So we can be like a jackal and tear people down, or we could be like a giraffe and try to try to build them up. We can be a jackal and tear ourselves down. We can say, oh, I'm overwhelmed and I'm not a great mentor. Or we can say, you know what, I'm curious about becoming a good mentor. And today I heard some skills and I'm going to pick one and practice it. So do you want to be a jackal or a giraffe? And then I want to show you one other thing. So we have milkweed in our front garden because my wife loves to garden and she likes to put in natural plants. And milkweed is what monarch butterflies need. So this is going to become this. And I just think that's amazing, right? All the genetic information, all the proteins that are needed. If they're in the right environment and they have milkweed specifically, that little, you know, a caterpillar becomes that amazing monarch butterfly. And sometimes when I'm frustrated about mentoring, I just try to remember this monarch butterfly. If we give people the right environment and the right tools, they have the potential to do some amazing things. And so there will be ups and downs. There will be bumps along the way. They will become a disillusioned learner. We will become a disillusioned learner. All the enthusiasm about mentoring will go away. But if we hold on, like we have the potential to make this. And I really, really think that is just so amazing. If we look at who we are and where we can soften edges and where we can grow, people will work hard for us. They work hard for themselves, but they also work hard for us. They'll grow and we'll realize that we contributed to it. And in the end, we'll also benefit. Sometimes we benefit more, sometimes we benefit less. But it is such an amazing thing to mentor people. And yeah, I think today must have felt sort of overwhelming of all the things you need to keep in mind. I also think, based on some of the questions, that there's some also discouraging element of, well, why doesn't my mentor do some of these things? Because I could really use some of these things. But if we want to change science, then we all have to sort of sit with these tools and think about these tools and try to incorporate them. So with that, I'll take some more questions. I know people are already checking out and leaving, but if there are any more questions, I can stay for a few more minutes. every time I do one of these webinars right now, I feel optimistic for the future. I know we're facing some really hard times, and I know there's going to be some rough bumps in terms of the economy and getting back to work, but you are truly a different generation of scientists, and it's really amazing. So the thank you, all of you typing in thank you, it isn't a thank you to me, it's really a thank you back at you. So with that, if there are any additional questions, I'll answer them now. And if not, I will schedule part 2 for next week. And if you can't be here, you can watch it afterward. Just register and you can watch it after the fact. Thank you. Any more questions? All right. Then if there are no more questions, everybody, it's late in the afternoon, at least on the East Coast, getting late in the afternoon. If you're on the West Coast, maybe accomplish a little bit more today. If you're on the East Coast, start savoring that the end of the day is coming up. Thank you all for being here, and take care.